Welcome back to Sacred Synergy for episode number 11 featuring Joan McManness. Joan grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and her Mennonite upbringing created a heart for the world. She and her husband and their 3 children lived in Indonesia for 13 years, and upon returning to the U.S., Joan taught English as a foreign language, as a second language, to adults in her Lancaster County, Pennsylvania community. Currently, Joan is exploring new avenues of faith and volunteering at Lancaster City's Welcome Desk for Refugees and Immigrants. In addition to enjoying biking with her husband, she adores her 3 adult children and loves spending time with her 4 grandchildren. Joan is someone who has really embraced Tara's visions and teachings and is applying them in real ways in her life. She is doing the work of co-creating meaning in the universe by actually being the boots on the ground. She is leading book studies within her church community, and she's dialoguing with her adult children about faith. So we'll get into more of that in today's episode. But while Joan comes from a Mennonite background, I think it's important to mention something that we also address within the episode, which is how Tara's thought applies rather easily to the spiritual tradition of almost anyone who is genuinely open to growing in the ways that God is calling them to. Ideas such as spiritual growth and diminishment, even the concept of divinization, apply beyond the Catholic and Christian frameworks and create a guide of sorts for authentic spiritual seekers, no matter their tradition or background. So we discussed Joan's background and how that has connected her with some powerful teachers, as well as how she has been inspired to share her learning experiences with others who hunger spiritually. Part of that journey is her practice of BioSpiritual Focusing. If you recall, our very first guest on Sacred Synergy for episode number 1 was John Keane, a BioSpiritual Focusing facilitator. So it's nice to see things come full circle in a way, where John and Joan together will be leading an upcoming book study that she shares more about during our conversation. Before we get into the episode, I want to talk about a fantastic retreat opportunity coming up at the end of this month. The American Teilhard Association will be gathering at Dalesford Abbey in Paoli, PA, from May 29th through 31st for a retreat titled Reimagining a Universe in the Making, where featured speaker Dr. Don Viney will lead us through process theology in relation to Teilhard's vision of an emergent universe. You can go to teilharddesjardins.org or dalesford.org for more details. And in November, the Center for Christogenesis is hosting a conference entitled Love, Conflict, and an Unfolding Universe, being held at Villanova University. It will feature talks from Ilya Dilio, Kathleen Duffy, Robert D. Castro, Dan Horan, and Gregory Stock. You can find details at Christogenesis.org, and God willing, I hope to see you at both of those events. Finally, my first book, Sacred Synergy, Spiritual and Psychological Growth in an Evolving World, was released last Tuesday, May 5th. I am very grateful for the support of my publisher, Paulus Press, and you can buy the book directly from their website at pauluspress.com or from the link in the show description. I am very excited to share this book with the world, and I am very grateful for the support of everyone who has already purchased a copy or plans to do so. This podcast is offered for free, so if you enjoy this content, I'm not making any money off of it. I don't have any sponsors, but if you find this kind of content valuable and you wish to support my work in the sense of offering your treasure, then buying Sacred Synergy is a great way to do that. And with that, it is now time for a conversation at the heart of evolution with Joan McManness. Joan, welcome to Sacred Synergy.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being with us today.
Sure.
So, Joan, please tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do with most of your time in the world.
Well, I am a Nana. I'm a mom and a wife, and I am a retired ESL teacher. My husband and I and family, we lived in Indonesia for about 13 years because I grew up in a Mennonite church and grasped a heart for the world pretty early on and kind of thought, I think I'll be living overseas one day. Indonesia was a really cool place to land for our family. And so since then, I've always enjoyed being in international settings. So upon coming back, I was the ESL teacher. I'm still currently volunteering at a welcome desk in Lancaster City. Lancaster, for the size of its city, is known as the refugee capital of the USA. So our per capita, mostly because of the Mennonites and their benevolence, So I volunteer there, and yeah, just consider myself to be a lifelong learner, which has, brought me to the study of Teilhard and then focusing, what we'll be talking about later.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to have you with us. And I appreciate that you said you're a lifelong learner. That's something that I have always branded myself as, or a lifelong student, always present in the classroom of life, or at least I try and be present. So I appreciate that we share that mutually. And something else that I think you are is a great connector too. I have mentioned your name before on this podcast, the first episode with John Keane, where we talked about BioSpiritual Focusing. That came from a connection that you had nurtured between John and I. And then eventually Brian McLaren and I connected for a conversation. And that was also because you were a catalyst for that connection. So would you mind saying something a little bit about those connections that you have forged and you're forging with your work?
Yeah. Well, my friendship with Brian goes back a ways because as my husband and I were doing work in Indonesia, we approached our work in a very contextualized way. And it just so happened that with some of Brian's writing, specifically Church on the Other Side, and Generous Orthodoxy, that when we would come home on furlough, we would grab hold of those books and take them back with us. And they became great reads and helps to us along the way. And that's what forged my relationship with Brian and the whole, emergent movement that I wanted to become an advocate for young people trying to navigate their faith and religion. And, Brian was a great point person for that. And with John, then my interest in biospiritual focusing, blossomed, and I began reaching out to various sources that I thought could connect me with a deeper understanding of the process. And along the way, I was also looking for people who would be interested in Pete and Ed, who started focusing, and their interest in Teilhard. And John Keane was definitely one of those people who saw the connection. And then, of course, I wanted to connect them with you and just get their stories, and their appreciation for Teilhard out to the broader public.
Well, I am certainly grateful for those connections that you offered to me, and then hopefully we've offered to an even larger audience through the podcast and whoever may be connecting and tuning in that way. I really appreciated all those conversations I've had on the show, but especially those two. They stand out to me each for their own specific reasons. And we'll get into a little bit about more of those things topically today as we talk about you and your own journey with this stuff. So the person who connected you and I and a much larger network of people, his name has already been mentioned before, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Yeah. So how and when did you first meet Teilhard?
Well, this might be a long story, only because
that's
Andrew,
okay.
I feel like being a lifelong learner, I'm on a journey. So I've been in that river of learning and for a long, long time. But even back to our time in Indonesia, and as I mentioned, drawing on the resources that Brian was putting out there at the time of more contextualized approach that applied even overseas. And then I began reading Jürgen Moltmann and his book on creation. And his ideas really matched our situational experience in Indonesia, trying to understand an Asian context of faith and religion, and in embracing creation as not a thing to control, but to partner with and to understand on a spiritual level, getting away from dualities. And so Jürgen Moltmann, I feel, was a platform to introduce me to Teilhard. And then when we got back here, I was still very interested in the emergent church and creation, a longing for a connection with creation. Somewhere along the way, I started looking up readings and videos of Thomas Berry. And then I began watching, I think I watched a TED Talk by Mary Evelyn Tucker, who then later did a podcast with Brian McLaren. So that was a gorgeous connection that I had nothing to do with it, but in my mind, I'm like rejoicing because this is making sense, all these connections. And then, of course, along the way with Sister Kathy, who introduced me to some book studies. And she just, I think, imbibed the generosity, inclusivity, hopeful kind of kindness that I enjoyed talking with her about with the book club on those generous Zoom calls. And then there was a podcast with Krista Tippett and Ursula King, which just, so then I got Ursula King's biography on Teilhard, and I asked for that Christmas like 3 years ago. And then it was, of course, I read John Hatt's book on the cosmic vision of Teilhard de Chardin. I'd like to say that John Hatt is kind of like a Teilhard whisperer in a way, like, he had me at some of the words from Teilhard, like, centration or everything is garnered, he had me at that point. And just really in John Hatt's book, introducing the idea that we're not in a fixed state of just an eternal hope, but we are in a moving, a fullness yet to come is what John really kind of communicated in that book. And so I read that. And along the way, a dear friend of mine, who in the Mennonite world anyway, was a very well-loved and respected missiologist who had worked in Africa and the Middle East. And we inherited part of his library. And in his library was the spirituality of Teilhard de Chardin. His name, the missionary mentor, was David Shank. And one of the quotes from this book that was written by Thomas Corbishley, who was a contemporary of Teilhard, but he was a Jesuit in London. He graduated from Oxford. So I would just like to read one quote from that book, and then all of these things combined to, capture my heart for Teilhard.
Sure, yeah.
This is a quote from that book. Through our human activities, whereby we seek to transform our allotted sphere and our particular area of the cosmic whole, Christ is at work in us, divinizing our activities, and so divinizing the world. And how can you go wrong with that? It's just such an enchanting invitation. And when I visited my mentor, David, he wasn't doing well in the retirement home, and I showed him this book, and I said, David, what does this book on Teilhard mean to you? And he was kind of slumped over, but then he looked up and he said, it's a book of hope. And that has captured my heart. I have evolved in my own faith. So somewhere along the way, I wrote a letter to my adult children called Thank God for Evolution and My Evolving Faith. And just, expanding their ideas of what religion and faith could be as well, coming out of a more traditional setting. So in a sense, growing together as a family too.
That's wonderful. And just candidly now, if I can, what was their response like? I mean, not specifically, but generally, what was the tone like?
You mean my children?
Yeah.
They really appreciated it. And to be honest, we've had more open dialogues about faith and mysteries than I think perhaps we might have had I not been on my own journey.
Yeah.
My one son, when he was home visiting from California, he said, I would like to aspire to be a mystic. So I've always just encouraged my kids to keep learning. There's not a point at which we can ever say we know everything there is to know. And so it's been good.
Yeah. And I think that if we really pursue what we are called to do in this world, that helps us acknowledge our mystical abilities that we have inherent, but I think they kind of go latent within a lot of us in that way. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Having young children myself, that's one of the many things I think about in terms of the future, in terms of their faith, and how this time now is impacting them, especially how my study of Teilhard is impacting them. Like my daughter asked me just this last week, she was like, when you give talks, why do you talk about Teilhard so much? I was like, oh, what a great question. And I said, well, because the way he explains his understanding of things has really helped me to understand God better and to have a better relationship with God and with the world that way. And she goes, oh, that makes sense. So,
good job, Andrew.
So, I mean, I just appreciate, that candid exchange between you and your children that way. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a little bit about this as you were explaining how you and Teilhard met in terms of journey, but how has his more cosmic vision influenced you and your life and your ministry?
Yeah, I think, like I was saying, something that popped out to me from John's book was that everything is garnered, nothing is lost. Also that we are co-laborers with God in a sense that we're still in this evolutionary journey to fullness and wholeness, and we're still evolving as people, and that means our spiritual life too, I would hope, so that, there are things that it's not that I hadn't ever thought of in the sense of some of these topics, but in a much fuller way and in the framework of evolution, just really opened up a world for me. And also in ways of just like, how Teilhard talks about passivities of growth or things that can happen to us we're out of control of, but that, life moves on. God has a purpose. We're all being called to the up ahead, not the up above. And so just a sense also of, hey, I have space to imagine. I can have space to dream. I can try things that, guess what? They might not be accepted by everybody. And that's cool. That's okay. Like, that's actually right. That's the way it happens. And so just that and the liberty, I think more inclusivity, less of seeing people necessarily as, an object with my goal in mind, but more of a, what can we learn? How are we on this life journey together as humans? Yeah. And just the whole idea of hope, nothing is lost. And I really, really love the idea that our consciousness can be increased. I think it was Ursula King who said to Krista Tippett on that interview that humans are the most incendiary form of matter, only because we become so self-reflective. And Kathy Duffy, in her book on the mysticism of Teilhard, she says that if Teilhard were alive today, I'm paraphrasing, he would use all the science that we've learned and probably apply it to his mysticism. He would have kept doing that, in a sense.
Yeah.
And I've always been intrigued by the joining of science and faith. And so all of that bundled up has kept me just like in a playful state of wanting to know more with this new framework.
Well, that's lovely. I appreciate that word playful too, because I think there has to be a sense of amazement, a sense of wonder as we engage with creation through the eyes of a child, right? As Jesus emphasizes in his teaching. That paradigm of evolution is very powerful. I agree, because it can be applied to anything, anywhere. Like you said, it can be applied to your own personal growth, your spiritual journey. It could be applied to your family of origin story, right? And that can be looked at as an evolution. You go outside and just observe a landscape, and it's an evolution of time and space. And we just briefly discussed the dynamic of children, and your children are grown now, and I had little children. And I know that there's so much complexity within raising a family. There's so much complexity within life, but especially within family. We have all these other people And I think it's common to find ourselves going, oh, we wish we did this a little different with him or her or something, or wish we were
Yeah.
budgeting better or something. Like there's always a regret.
It's
There's
always,
always
yeah.
something to go back and say, I wish we could have done that better. But I think that gift of evolution is the
Yeah.
long picture, the long view, and
Yeah.
how, okay, for how many years we may not have done something, but today is a new day. And if
Yeah.
I can change 1% of what I was doing that I hope to improve, that's
Mhm.
really the story of evolution. It's a great story of both successes and failures.
Absolutely.
And like
Yeah.
you said, just being a student and a learner, it's a great process of learning and education in that way too, I think.
Yeah. And if we can understand, and apply those principles, like you were saying, to everyday life of complexification, um, convergence,
Mhm.
divergence, and emergence, like no matter what, those things are going to happen. So we can just wake up every day with that emergent day and know that it's all going to happen again. you know?
That's so true. It's not all going to be growth. It's going to be growth and diminishment every day. Some days it's
Yeah.
going to be a lot more diminishment than growth, right? But that's the power of Teilhard's teaching, is that only through that diminishment can there be growth, and vice versa and whatnot. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciate that as well. You mentioned that. So, Joan, you have mentioned this previously in our beginning of our conversation about hosting book studies, and you've done that in the context of your church. So, if you could just off the top of your head, maybe share a list of some of the Teilhardian titles that you've dove into with your
Okay.
community, and
Yes.
what the response has been like generally.
The Teilhardian takeaways.
I love that. Yeah, Teilhardian takeaways.
I've been delighted to have some of my friends and my Sunday school at church, so two different groups, join me in studying Teilhard, and mostly two readings. The John Hatt's book, The Cosmic Vision of Teilhard, and then also The Divine
Mm.
Milieu. And so basically, various age groups in both of these two different book clubs. It's been very interesting to me, some of the older people who have responded, some of them almost in a sense having grown up in traditional church and that has not seen science as a part of faith talk, had reached a point of almost agnosticism, or just really, really questioning, because one was a doctor and intrigued obviously by science and also the cosmos, and never saw a connection until I mean, he probably did personally, but Teilhard, in his book, and John Hott made this connection with the cosmos, and it's just like he's now on his own journey with reading as much as Teilhard as he can. Others in that Sunday school class were younger, and so they thought to themselves, well, what's the big, like, surprise about evolution? Like, we knew there's, but I have to say that I'm not sure that even if you can believe in evolution and not apply it in the ways that we were just talking about, or even to our faith, you can still have a traditional sense of, my soul was saved for heaven, so I'm just playing this waiting game, and still believe in evolution, and not have it affect those parts of your life that can bring a zest for living and creativity. They really appreciated enjoying being in a group to unpack it, because and these are intellectual, real thinkers, but it took like reading things in a group and sometimes over and over again to say, okay, this is a different framework. How does it fit with my faith framework from before? And more specifically, really enjoying creation as being like the first incarnation, the idea of God sir animating everything in
Mm.
matter. And then, yeah, the divinization of even our passivities,
Right.
So those are some of the specific things. But overall, just a thrill. And one book studies on its second year now. We'll probably do another book this fall.
That's great. Yeah. I really am excited about the enthusiasm that these groups seem to have. I mean, you're in the second iteration of a study, so that shows there's a hunger there for this thought. And I think, at least for me, one of the great gifts of Teilhard's way
Mhm.
of teaching and explaining things is that he puts a language and puts a vocabulary around inner dynamics, like you talk about growth, passivity, things like that, divinization, that apply across the Christian spectrum of denominations of practice, and really across the spiritual spectrum, I think, beyond
True.
just, you know,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
isms of different
Yeah.
religions in that way.
Yeah.
And that's what's really so little c Catholic,
Yeah.
meaning universal, about Teilhard's thought and that his vision, that it applies to, I would say, almost anyone who is
Yeah.
at least a little bit conscious of their spiritual life in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And we talked about those, the trans, um, you know, application that it can have to all the isms. And it's interesting because almost across the board, when people are like blending this new framework with their other framework for faith in a more traditional sense, they're wondering, like, can I think this? Can I feel this? But
Mhm.
they're actually on the inside, it's just like they'll often say, this is the way I thought it, this is always the way I thought it should be. Like, this is making so much sense. It's like everybody's taken, a deep breath of like it's confirmation of what just feels right, on the inside. So that's been a really beautiful thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was having a previous conversation on an episode with Ilya Dilio, and
Yeah.
one of the things that came up in our conversation was this kind of like late or delayed appreciation that people tend to have for Teilhard, where if they don't get him or he doesn't kind of resonate or click with them in the moment. They may
Yes.
even have an opposition to his
Yeah.
thought, be it for I
Yeah.
don't know, maybe they lean towards creationism, or maybe they're
Mhm.
more of a Thomist or something like that. But it's like, without fail, I've had people
Yeah.
who have objected to his thought or some element or dynamic of his way of seeing the world come to me on a delay and been like, hey, I was just reading this article about something in science and it made me think of what you had been talking about with Teilhard, or I read this new theological article and it put this in a new framework which we had been discussing and I disagreed with you before, or something like that. And it's just quite this neat phenomenon.
Yeah. And don't you find too, it feels like, I don't know if I want to use the word popularized, but it feels like he's being quoted or mentioned, or ideas being shared with from other people, writers, articles, magazines, so many different ways in which his message is still, being told, and just as much as ever, maybe even more.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, and this is something I think I've alluded to before. I don't know if it's been on this podcast or something else I recorded, but at the time when I started studying Teilhard, it's going over, say, 10, maybe 15 years ago, if you were to do a Google image search of like Teilhard quotes or Teilhard, the research results would be quite limited. But now it's quite overwhelming in terms of not just images of him and
Yeah.
images that the search engines are drawing from different websites and stuff that people are using for articles, but also just the amount of, like, you've seen those little fancy brainy quotes or whatever they call them, where it's like a fancy landscape of a background and there's the nice
Right.
quote in there.
Right.
There's just so many of them now because I think that, to our point, his spiritual principles or way of explaining spiritual principles is
Mhm.
really starting to resonate on a mass scale now.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fun. It's refreshing. And yeah, to the people who are coming along, it's kind of like validating too, in a sense, or maybe not validating as much as rewarding, just,
Yeah.
oh, wow. Okay. Like, so, yeah, it's fun to be
I
on the
know
team.
that feeling for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you shared about some of the people when we opened here that led you to Teilhard. You talk about Moltmann, you talk about Thomas Berry, you talked about Mary Evelyn Tucker and Ursula King. But someone who Teilhard kind of led you to was this practice of biospiritual focusing, and John Keane is a great teacher of that. So
Yeah.
how and when did you discover this practice of
Yeah.
biospiritual focusing?
So for a while, Andrew, just broadening my own faith and my own sense of things. I was longing for a more embodied, sort of practice in my own faith. Heard this from several young people in my life too. Like, for example, someone said, if I ever, return to a faithful walk in spirituality, it would have to include a more embodied sense. And I'm feeling that for myself. And from reading Teilhard and just realizing the importance of matter, and I think that we see that with Thomas Berry and his love for creation. But I began to think about matter in our own bodies as a symbol of the incarnation too, and the depths at which we can explore our own bodies to the sense of how can we follow, how can we get to that omega point and increase consciousness without understanding the illumination that can come from a sense of who we are on the inside. So grasping at different things, but I felt like Teilhard's saying this pretty strongly, I feel like he's leading us there. And then I came across two books written by the same Jesuit priests, Peter Campbell and Ed McMahon. And you can tune into your podcast, Andrew, those who are watching, to your interview with John Keane and learn more about them. So that's how I got in touch with, I never met those two gentlemen, but in reading their books. And Peter Campbell had based a lot of his doctorate writing on Teilhard. And so there's just this beautiful overlap. And I saw that in the very first pages of this book that I opened, and I was like, eureka, like I found the connection. It was just like so exciting. So this need for a more embodied faith and increased consciousness. And so I just have been eating up those books, attending some Zoom calls where Anne McLaren with Still Point out of California leads us in this kind of like Ignatius, centering prayer, but in a different way. And then taking some classes through Genesis Spiritual Life Center up in Massachusetts. And then along the way, I saw some of John, who he is the international director for BioSpiritual Focusing. Just shot him an email because I thought I had missed a book club that he was doing. And he said, oh, no, you haven't. And I do monthly, talks and this and that. And we got to talking. And I said, what do you know about Teilhard? And we met several times reading Kathy's book on the mysticism of Teilhard and just really connected. And the rest of that is history. So now those are my two loves, the Teilhard's vision and the connection with biospiritual focusing, which I like to call formation as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that journey. I agree in terms of that call and that need for an embodied practice of our faith. It's something that can't. I'm trying to remember the person who said it now in a conversation. I forget, but our faith can't be from the neck up. It has to be a total thing of wholeness, a total body experience. So how has biospiritual focusing influenced your spirituality and your Christian identity?
Yeah. Well, first, if I could, just to, backtrack a little bit with how I made that connection in my own mind. And maybe
Sure.
From these few quotes that I read, you'll see the connection or the heart of, what I'm experiencing to answer your exact question.
Sure.
I guess in the newsletter on the American Teilhard Association website, you can see an article that I wrote about biospiritual focusing and the connection with Teilhard. But that article starts out with something I said, that there is a depth to our bodies knowing the spirit in the matter of our own flesh is waiting to live a more congruent and unified life with one another, with Christ, and with the whole universe. And these are just some of the things that started the fire inside of me to long more and more. Ed and Pete, who were the Jesuits who developed this practice, they just really feel that a gentle listening to your own body taps into this evolutionary current and the potentiality of increased consciousness. They say so in their book, and they quote Teilhard on that. And I'm just really all about that. If I can awaken something within myself that represents the incarnation of Jesus, and become more alive to his love flowing within me, because now I am recognizing it and giving it attention, then I think that centeredness can come. Also in the article, I mentioned that Ed and Pete talked about Teilhard's lookout point reference.
Yeah.
And there's a quote in there that from Teilhard that talks about, we can measure good and evil and, argue forever about in whose interpretation is good and evil. But, in the end, we need a higher lookout point to kind of regulate our move forward to greater consciousness and this organizing energy that I think he talked about in the noosphere. So that really kind of got me going. And then when I began the practice, and it's very much a learning journey. It's nothing like once and done. And I'm still learning how to listen, but as an example, I was mentioning that I've had some health issues over the last year. And I think part of my angst was just fighting over, why this, why me, why now? I was very much up in my head with a lot of worry. I had a lot of tests, procedures, blah, blah, blah. And I decided to, give myself some time to do a focusing practice. And when I was listening to what my body was trying to tell me is, I heard, you're aging, we're getting older, and we can do this either the hard way or the easy way. And it just really took that as a nugget of grace, love. And that's maybe a silly example, but it just brought me so much peace. So that's just one example. And I've used this process over and over again when I feel like, I'm thinking so much, I'm going down the road of worry, or I'm thinking so much, I'm analyzing things, I'm manipulating other people, or why did I react that way? My first thought is to be highly reactionary rather than to go into myself and understand what would bring me peace, or why am I being reactionary? So there's many, many ways in which the BioSpiritual Focusing has brought peace and joy to me personally, but also the excitement of, could this be a piece of the journey of the flow of the river that Teilhard was talking about to increase consciousness? Because when we bring that focus into ourselves, we're bringing that love, we're bringing this listening, calm attention. We're just camping out with what's inside. We're not trying to fix anything. And we're often just saying, how do you want me to be with you? Talking to the insides of ourselves. So bringing ourselves that agape love, I think, is what's going to really springboard into bringing the world that agape love that Teilhard was talking about.
Amen. Yeah, I appreciate your candid sharing there. I think that really speaks as an example to that theme of embodiment, and how this practice is really a practice of embodiment, spiritually, faith in that dynamic. And we see how our bodies, how the matter of our beings is a part of that, right?
Yeah,
we're bringing through this practice and other similar practices of mindfulness and contemplation, we're bringing a specific consciousness in relationship to the body, to matter in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, Jesus was probably one of the most obviously embodied people who ever walked the face of the earth. And I think he was probably listening always listening to the
Yeah.
inside and not just operating, love and teaching and where am I going to go next or what am I willing to sacrifice. That didn't come from here up. It was a whole embodied experience. And if I could just read, I think this is in the article as well, but
Mhm.
from Teilhard, and this is kind of another place where I found that connection in the Divine Milieu when he was talking about the lookout point. Where are we going to find that? And in the Divine Milieu, especially in the section entitled The Passivities of Growth and the Two Hands of God, Teilhard says he's taking a plunge into his inner being. And he
Yeah.
says, we must try to penetrate our most secret self and examine our being from all sides. Let us try patiently to perceive the ocean forces to which we are subjected and in which our growth is, as it were, steeped. So, he says, I took the lamp and leaving the zone where everything seems clear, went down to the deep abyss where I feel dimly that my power of action emanates. At each step of the descent, a new person was disclosed within me, and out of it came arising, I know not from where, the current which I dare to call my life. And so I think he was feeling this, he was putting it into his own words. And then these sweet brothers, Ed and Pete, kind of brought a formation
Yeah.
to this practice, which is really beautiful. And in memory of Teilhard, as they state in their book. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Teilhard gives a lot of nice spiritual schematics in his
Uh-huh.
works, especially I'm thinking in the Divine Milieu, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
And he gives like some instruction in that, but I feel like, yeah, there's a bit more instruction or explanation that's needed to get a fuller grasp of his teaching. I don't think you get the fullness. Well, to get the fullness of it, I think that's a lifelong commitment and practice. And even then, you're only going to get so much that's possible to get on the mortal coil, and then you've got to wait to see what's on the other side of transcendent embodiment, right? But yeah, I think that the more guides we have, like you said, John Haught is a Teilhard whisperer. Someone
Yeah.
else that comes to mind is a Lou Savory, has such a gift of taking such complex, heady topics and really distilling them into some workable concepts.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's so many great authors that can do that, that have that skill. So it certainly is a gift what Ed and Pete and John have been able to pass on and teach in that way.
Yeah. And that's what and John, yeah, I think especially of John and Anne and a lot of great coaches up at this Genesis Spiritual Life Retreat Center. Another thing that Ursula said to Krista on that podcast was, we need these teachers. we need the teachers. We need the guides. We need the frameworks, because she talks about humanization and hominization and amorization. I think she mentions that in all one sentence. But just to say that, where is this move towards greater love going to come from? Where is this higher increased consciousness of love going to come from? And I think we need to develop within those practices that can bring those results of greater love towards ourselves, greater love towards others, and the earth, which was Thomas Berry's passion.
Yeah. Well, Joan, I really appreciate all the insight and your journey that you've shared today. So when you take an objective look at our world today and you are able to look at all the good things that are happening, all the trouble things that are happening, what allows you to be hopeful and to look toward the future?
Yeah. I think the fact that we are on a journey is hopeful. And, hopefully, new things will emerge that haven't been there before because of some of the hard things that we're going through. So I find hope in that. And I feel like we almost have no choice, because it can be exciting to wake up every day if you feel like, what can I do to further that journey, to get closer to that goal, to bring love into the world. And there was one more quote that I wanted to read from Teilhard. I think it's from the Divine Milieu. He says, "We must try everything for Christ. We must hope everything for Christ. That is the true Christian attitude. To divinize does not mean to destroy, but to surcreate. We shall never know all that the incarnation still expects of the world's potentialities. We shall never put enough hope in the growing unity of mankind." And so just to know that we can be co-laborers with God, that he will animate the things that we put our hands to, whether we're successful or not. Everything is garnered.
Right.
Nothing is lost. So that gives me hope.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that. And as a question I ask all the guests on the show, how do you find synergy with the sacred?
Being that all things are sacred, I find synergy by connecting. So you were right about me, Andrew, in the beginning. I do like bringing it back to the beginning. I just think it's really cool how ideas come together, almost, mysteriously. People on other sides of the globe are thinking similar things.
Yeah.
I find that really interesting. Expressions of charity that are happening all over the world, and the potential for science and faith to come together. I just think there's so much potential in that and the synergy between those two things.
Yeah. I like that. Well, Joan, thanks so much for being with us today. Like I said, really grateful for all of your sharing, all of your openness, and all of your wisdom that you've accumulated and shared with us today that you've experienced along your journey. So you've mentioned these book studies that you're involved in and some BioSpiritual Focusing projects. So is there anything that you're involved in now or you have coming up that you would want to share with our audience that they can also plug into?
Yeah, well, with Kathy's permission, John and I are going to be promoting a book study that we're going to start in the fall.
Wonderful.
So watch for that on the American Teilhard Association website, and also a further description of that book study. We would love to have any of you join us. It will be specifically and purposefully tying in the formation of, embodiment, that biospiritual, with Teilhardian thought. So specifically for those in the Teilhard world. And the book we'll be using is Rediscovering the Lost Body Connection Within Christian Spirituality. So be watching for that.
That's a good book. I have that one. That's one that Joan recommended to me, and then through some of the other folks that she connected me with. She mentioned Anne, she mentioned John. They furthered my study with that. Though I need to say that Joan is a much more accomplished practitioner of biospiritual focusing than I am by any means. If you're looking for a more authoritative source on the subject, please go to her, and she can steer you in the right direction. So. That's a great offering that we have coming up here through the American Teilhard Association. And Joan, will you be joining us at the end of this month in Paoli at Dalesford Abbey?
I will. So I hope to see a lot of you there and see you there, Andrew.
Great. So we look forward to seeing Joan then, and hopefully some of you who are tuning in today can also join us at Dalesford Abbey for the American Teilhard Association's retreat at the end of this month in May. And we look forward to all the connections that we'll continue to make, both virtually and in person as we go forward into the future.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for being with us today, Joan.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been fun.
Thanks. Peace.